Alternative connection: I have become a cat. Yuiko Amano. Chapter 1. Arrival. Lose cat. I have become a cat. It seems that there is still human consciousness here. But the cat's lenses are already eroding me. It's probably also due to the milk prepared by my owner, Ms. Sachs. Anyway, before I got buried in this chaos, I had to go to Lose Cat and ask for my pride. In retrospect, I still vividly remember my first visit to London. I spent my time in Japan until I graduated from university, and decided to go to Europe without knowing anything about Western culture except what I'd learnt in novels or fairy tales. But when I actually saw London for the first time, it was exactly the same as the London of novels and films. Yes, it was raining that day, and it was already dark and cold. I took the tube from Heathrow Airport to the centre of London, where I would stay for the time being. When I got off the train at Baker Street, countless headlights were shaking in the rain. I approached a black cab waiting at the traffic lights at an intersection, showed the address paper to the driver, and got in the car. "How's it going?" "Sorry, how's it going?" The driver spoke English with a terrible accent, but I tried to reply as much as I could, sounding like an Australian, but in a London accent probably. The driver said he had travelled to Japan before. I was told that he had visited Kyoto, where I had lived until yesterday. So I was pulled back to the land where I should have had an eternal farewell in a day. It was difficult to understand the English driver, but because his story was endless and he was very friendly, I did not feel anxious. Yes, I was uplifted. Ms. Sachs was a member of an English family that accepted homestays, who I found in Japan through a university introduction. Mr. and Ms. Sachs, an elderly English couple, rented the house's vacant rooms out to overseas students, and I had exchanged many emails with Ms. Sachs before my departure. The black cab arrived at a place that seemed to be near the house. I gave him the pound notes I had just exchanged at the airport, and the driver took my suitcase out of the boot. Ms. Sachs's house was in Zone 3 on a residential street lined with houses. The house was number 39, but I couldn't find a number 39 anywhere, and I went back and forth on the street for a while. The area was pitch black, and only clue to finding the door was the light from the street lamps and leaking from the houses. On the other side of the street, I saw a young couple pushing a pram. "Excuse me," I called out to them. The couple looked surprised, but the man told his wife to stay where she was and approached me. He replied to me as if he had seen an alien. "Yes. What do you need?" I asked for number 39, but they weren't sure, as they lived on a different street. After the couple left, I was still at a loss with a heavy suitcase. At that time, a cat, probably a cat, appeared before me. I say probably because his movements were like a human's. He stood under the streetlight, stared at me for a while, and then told me to follow him. As he began lead the way, about 30 feet away, I found house 39. The cat sat in front of the door for a while and then said, "See you," and left. This was my first encounter with Lose Cat. Ms. Sachs was exactly the kind of British woman I had imagined before I came to England. She was very strict. I could use the shower until 10 am, or until 10:30 at night. And I could shower for up to 8 minutes. Once, when my shower stretched to about 10 minutes, she knocked on the bathroom door and said, "It's over time." She had a tea party every Tuesday at 3 p.m., inviting her neighbors into the living room. Her husband was very kind and his Yorkshire accent made it difficult for me to understand what he was saying, but I was always happy to talk to him in a friendly manner. Like me, an Italian female student was boarding at Ms. Sachs's house. She wasn't very friendly and she didn't talk to me much when I met her in the kitchen. She was very serious for a young student. She didn't go out much, and I felt a little cramped because she stayed home all day during the holidays. The other student had brought a cat from Italy. The cat had long white hair and was a surprisingly noble cat, and everyone in the house respected her. Ms. Sachs called her Princess Puss. There was an illustration of a cat in my room, a picture of a cat drawn in detail with a blue pen. I felt I was familiar with this cat, because it looked just like the cat who had taken me to Ms. Sachs's house when I first arrived. Whenever I came back from school, this cat would appear as I came down the street, follow me to Ms. Sachs's house, and communicate in front of the door as I entered. Ms. Sachs's husband called him Lou's cat. I heard that a Taiwanese student named Lou had been using my room until a few months before I arrived. The painting in the room was said to have been drawn by him and sent to Ms. Sachs. He was always with the cat in front of the house, and that's why Ms. Sachs called the cat Lou's cat. Though Lou's cat was owned by someone near here. But Ms. Sachs didn't even know which house they lived in. Anyway, I ended up being followed every day by Lou's cat. I didn't give him any food. I didn't do anything to him when I saw him on the street. But when he came out in front of me, he would always talk to me. It was really strange. Another cat, Princess Puss, was also deeply involved in my life overseas. After all, she thought of my room as her room. The Italian housemate moved in after Taiwanese Lou left, but her cat used my room as her only room instead of spending time in her owner's room. One night, I returned home a little late and was tired, so I got into bed without turning the lights on and tried to fall asleep. But I felt something other than myself in the bed. When I pulled back the duvet, Princess Puss was sleeping there as if it were a matter of course. I asked her politely to get out of there, as I was paying rent to have the right to sleep in this bed. Dozens of cats came and went around Ms. Sachs's house. Her garden especially was a social gathering place for many cats. But the cats only came in her absence, so she wouldn't believe it when I told her. The strange thing is that, for some reason, the cats often contacted me. At one point, when I had no classes on the weekend, I got up a little late for breakfast and went to wash the dishes in the kitchen, when I heard the sound of knocking on the window in front of me. When I turned to the window, a dark gray cat with a beautiful coat was looking right at me while knocking on the glass. I felt a bit embarrassed about getting involved with more cats. So I left the kitchen without replying to her. She continued to knock on the windows and glass doors in Mr. Sachs's relaxing room from time to time when I was nearby. But why was the cat so persistent? I had no idea how to answer this question. That's because I'd never in my life been involved with cats. At the beginning of my life, what I thought was a cat was a snowman. When I was 2 years old, I lived in the city of Boulder in the United States due to my parents' work. And when we had heavy snowfall in winter, I often made snowmen with my dad. One day, the snowman was a cat with ears and a beard. My parents were very busy with work. So I was left in various places until I was 12 years old. I have few happy memories of my childhood, but the cat snowman is my most, maybe my only, wonderful childhood memory. I had never been involved with a real cat, though there were dogs from time to time. My parents hated pets, especially my mother, and my grandmother, who temporarily raised me. She said, "I hate cats the most in the world. So when cats come to our garden, my mother and grandmother would make a fuss and drive them away. That's why it had been impossible to interact with cats in my life before now. For that reason, I lived a life where I never thought about cats, so when I first came to this European country, it was such a mysterious phenomenon to be suddenly followed by cats." Lou's cat's attempts at contact were escalating every day. The first thing I found strange about his actions was that he would do nothing when someone other than me passed by. When other residents passed, he showed no interest in them and only followed me when I came by. And almost every time, he would cling to my feet or roll in front of me and come to talk. I had one hypothesis. Perhaps this cat was a domestic cat somewhere, but the Taiwanese student who had my room before me had given him special treats. And the cat was dissatisfied that he didn't get any treats now that Lou was gone, but then he found an Asian with a similar face and thought he'd get the same treatment again. I think they had been friendly. If this were true, it would be a very disappointing story. It's like someone who, after being touched by a lover, goes out with a person similar to that lover to fill their loneliness. I was reluctant to be his dear substitute. But I went to a Japanese grocery store in Piccadilly Circus to find out what he might want. It was probably a tin of fish, because that's what the Taiwanese guy used to give to the cats. It was a standard treat for cat in Asia. When I got back to the house later that day, Lou's cat was waiting. I took out the tin of fish I had just bought and put it in front of him. But he didn't look at it at all, just clung to my feet as usual. I thought this was strange and tried putting other popular Asian cat food in front of him, one after another. But still he showed no interest. At that point, someone shouted at me, "What are you doing?" I was surprised to see a middle-aged English man and woman emerging from across the street. "Don't feed our cats." The woman came up to the cat and urged, "Look, let's go home." I thought this was really awkward, and I didn't want to get involved in the hassle. So I stood up to escape and hurriedly walked towards Ms. Sachs's house, but Lou's cat still clung to my feet and followed me. And when I saw the incredible faces of the English couple, I was convinced that the cat's attitude was unusual. "You're feeding and taming him." The man blamed me in a furious voice. In fact, Lou's cat didn't eat any of my food. On the contrary, I had nothing to do with him. However, looking at the cat's attitude, it seemed unlikely that the couple would believe that. So I just said, "I'm sorry, but this cat isn't eating my food," and ran into Ms. Sachs's house. Lou's cat stayed in front of Ms. Sachs's house for a while after I went inside. Chapter 2. Confusion. Spells and Consciousness. The mysterious behavior of Lou's cat continued, and I began to walk fast whenever I got to the street of Ms. Sachs's house. As usual, he appeared in front of me every time, clinging to the partition. Since I had started living in Ms. Sachs's house, various mysterious phenomena had occurred. I'd had some strange experiences in Japan. But the peculiar phenomena I'd experienced since coming to England were surprisingly clear. The first thing that happened was that the lights in the room flashed around 10 p.m. every night after I moved in. There was no particular problem at other times, but when I was doing assignments, the blinking bulbs were very annoying. I consulted Ms. Sachs's husband on this issue, but tilting his head, he replied curiously, "That's weird. I just replaced the bulb recently, so it shouldn't flicker anymore." When he came to see the room, the blinking had subsided, so I asked several times before finally getting the light bulb replaced. There was another horrifying event at the same time as the light bulb malfunction. One Monday night around 10 p.m., Ms. Sachs's husband's old pendulum clock in the entrance hall suddenly started to chime loudly. The pendulum clock continued to ring for about 10 minutes. And everyone at home gathered in the entrance hall in surprise to stare at the clock. The problem was that the pendulum clock had been purchased when Ms. Sachs's husband was born, that is, he had owned the clock for nearly 80 years, and for the last 40 years, it had not made a sound. Ms. Sachs looked stunned. The couple decided to call a nearby repair shop the next day. By the way, the new term had begun, and although I had expected it, the foreign students were struggling with all sorts of problems, such as language barriers and difficulty keeping up with classes. By now, Lou's cat was my closest friend. He was also the friend who followed me the most. Under such loneliness and pressure, an event happened that finally drove me mad. Ms. Sachs and her husband always went to bed at 11 p.m., after which time I had to stay quiet, and that day, around 11:30, I was trying to go to sleep. However, out of nowhere, I heard someone's voice inside my room. It was like a man and a woman, probably British, speaking English, maybe talking about a house, were standing pretty close to me. And I'm not sure what the conversation was about, but a middle-aged man and woman, apparently not the Sachses, were talking. I thought perhaps I had finally gone crazy because of stress. Following the malfunction of the light bulbs and clock, which was not a big deal, but the toilet had also broken down, the Wi-Fi at home stopped working. Most of the class assignments had to be done on my laptop, so the lack of internet access was an emergency for me. Ms. Sachs's husband tried to do something right away. But unfortunately the cause was not immediately apparent. He said, "You should be able to use Wi-Fi in your room. I don't know which house it's from, but there's a Wi-Fi that can be used without a password. I'm sorry, you won't be able to use our Wi-Fi until the problem is solved." I had no choice but to connect to that free Wi-Fi. But I'm guessing this was actually my mistake and the beginning of the change. That day, after connecting my computer to the free Wi-Fi, my body began to change. Shortly after this, my Italian flatmate and her cat, Princess Puss, returned to Italy. It was just after Brexit referendum results, so it seemed that finding a job had become complicated for her. Certainly from then on, Europeans would seem to have to do something different to come to London. It was a little lonely to part with Princess Puss. But parting in life is inevitable. She was in and out of my room without permission until the end. By the time she went home, she liked me so much that she was waiting in front of the door every time I came out of the shower. Shortly after the Italians left, a Brazilian girl moved in. She was Rakia, and she was an indescribable and dangerous girl. But she was so outgoing that she soon became my friend. The Italian flatmate didn't really try to get involved with me until the end. I was asked by Ms. Sachs to go to the station to collect Rakia to navigate her. She had her big brother in Brazil, who said he was very familiar with Japan, but she said even though he was nearly 30, his attitude was like a child's. The first restaurant I went to with my new friend was the Mexican place in the local Westfield. One interesting place that she took me to was the Brazilian bar in Soho. She was taught how to dance the Brazilian ass dance, but I returned home without learning it. I presume that Latin dance needs talent. While I made new friends and was busy with assignments, My first friend in London, Lou's cat, disappeared before I knew it. But I was mercilessly unconcerned about it. However, the time of the change came suddenly. One autumn holiday, I'm sure it was Sunday, I suddenly became a cat. I couldn't explain it well. But I was clearly aware that I had become a cat. Specifically, I was walking around my room like Princess Puss, though I could never be as graceful as her. Confused, I rushed out of Ms. Sax's house, looking for Lou's cat for help, but he was nowhere to be seen. For the first time ever, I wanted to see him. Chapter 3. Makeover. Expansion of consciousness and thinking. I lost Lou's cat around December of my first year, but after a while, I had a lot more mysterious encounters. Specifically, encounters with cats. First of all, I met a cheerful American tomcat trio at a pub that I was taken to in January by a college friend. They were young teenagers, vocational school students, and had been in London for several months on internships. Miles of German descent, Ryan of Filipino descent, and Tom of Colombian descent were all fluent in English, as though it was natural. And they explained their roots, but they spoke too fast. So I'm not sure if this information is accurate. They had a lot of other friends, and every weekend they formed a clique in Soho. And they especially liked O'Neill's in Chinatown. I was invited many times to go in and out of O'Neill's. Chinatown's O'Neill's had a pub on the ground floor, a dance club on the first floor, a gig house on the second floor, Chinese karaoke on the third floor, and a mice auction for cats on the fourth floor. It was no longer common sense that good mice could be easily found in Soho. It is actually expensive. Ryan and Miles were both a kind of morbid Japanese culture freak, which is probably why I was invited out by them. And for some reason they were familiar with the Japanese-owned stores in Soho. Tom didn't come, because he wasn't very interested, but Ryan, Miles, and their Japanese friends would all go. They were very different in age and most were language students. I used to go to the secret karaoke room in Soho. The secret karaoke room was in the back of a second-hand bookstore on a street not far from Piccadilly Circus. Upon entering, there was a typical Japanese second-hand bookstore, just like those in downtown Tokyo, with a notorious middle-aged Japanese man sitting at the counter. He was called Caesar. There were rumors that he was hiding in London after committing a crime in Japan. I would like to go to the karaoke room. In a word, he silently handed over the microphone and Denmoku and told me I could find the room behind the counter. What a mysterious rule. There are probably many places like this in Soho, including more dubious and illegal shops. The karaoke room in the back was exactly the same as the ones in Japan, and all the songs were Japanese. It was interesting to be able to warp Soho, in the heart of London, into my hometown on the other side of the globe. I had a similar experience in India, but that's another story. The American trio returned to the United States in early summer, May. From around March, I also met cats in my neighborhood. In fact, behind Ms. Sax's house was a house where about 8 cats came and went regularly, and most of them were international students. They ranged from young students who came to study abroad to graduate students and middle-aged men and women who took long vacations from work and came on holiday. The landlord of the house was a middle-aged woman named Betty, who loved cats like no other. She was a very lovely woman, who lived with her recently retired British husband, and her cats. I became friends with Michelle, a Swiss girl, James, a Chinese student, and Samir, a graduate student from Azerbaijan. They happened to be staying in the house at the same time. And they seemed to get along. Ms. Sachs had a policy of not eating with her boarders, so I often had supper at Betty's house and ate with them every day. Originally from Azerbaijan, Samir had a difficult personality. He majored in criminal psychology and was a prideful and annoying man. He used to tell me bragging stories of meeting German women at nightclubs, and I'd grow tired of him halfway through, but in the end we became good friends. James, a student from Dalian, China, was a very serious student and had a slightly difficult personality. He'd been moving home ever since he came to London, because he didn't always get along with his landlords and seemed to get kicked out of every house he lived in. He finally found the land of peace at Betty's house. He had a close friend, a male student of the same age called Rosen. James and Rosen were like brothers who had met in a college language course and had been friends with each other for a long time. Rosen was a mild-mannered young man. And they were always studying together at a café in St. John's Wood. Michelle, a Swiss, was a ridiculous, abnormal woman, who attended nightclubs almost every day after work. She was the youngest of us, 19 years old, a cat with beautiful green eyes and gold fur. I saw her every time I had dinner, and every time I was informed that she was on her way out to Soho. She was so busy, but she sometimes took us to nightclubs on Saturdays. I remember Café de Paris in Soho. In London, the days were getting longer in the summer and the bright daylight lasted until nearly 10 o'clock at night, but it seemed to transform into a night city at 11. I was not accustomed to such a place, so in the queue for the club with my friends, I was a little worried. I had never been to a nightclub until I came to London. Café de Paris was, in a nutshell, the ball venue there. I followed Michelle in confusion, but in the end I had no choice but to dance while looking only at human shoes. Tired of dancing with Michelle and the others, I escaped the venue, and when I went to the bathroom, a black woman who had a bewitching atmosphere was sitting at the washbasin and called out to me, "Hey, did you quit the cat?" Another day, Michelle took us out with her to a nightclub on a Thames cruise boat. She seems to have got tickets from her colleague. I didn't feel like going because I was busy with assignments that night, but it was interesting to see the nightclub inside the small boat. Inside the ship, purple and blue and a slightly lighter beer occupied the view. Once I was on board, unlike a nightclub on land, I couldn't escape until we returned to the shore, and I felt like I was trapped in a spaceship. I got seasick from the rocking and went up to the deck to spit out a hairball. In summer, I went to Brighton with Michelle, James, and Samir. It was July, when Britain was, probably, in its brightest season. Our purpose, which took an hour by train from London, was of course the seafood of the famous pub. As the summer sunshine reflected off the waves, we chewed calamari. Our table was bathed in strong sunlight. And the blue tablecloth reflected in Michelle's blue sunglasses blended into the sky in the background. In the second half of my first year of university, I seemed like I was having a fun study abroad life, interacting with new friends, neighbors and flatmates, but in the end I was exhausted from being a cat. Of course, the university assignments were difficult and busy, and even when I got home, I sometimes felt tired of being in a noisy environment. I would walk from Ms. Sachs's house to see if I could think about several things alone. I often sat on a park bench. The first year passed and the chilly season was just around the corner. Chapter 4. Cause. Wrong connection. After all, I hadn't found any close friends since I entered university, although I had a lot of interaction with my flatmates, my neighbors' cats, and muzsaks. But at the end of my first year, I met a person who could be called a friend, although he was not a cat, because I couldn't find a cat in the university. I met him at the Chinese community at the university, under the name Lu. He had nothing to do with Lu's cat, he just happened to be another person with the same name. He was a graduate student from Imperial College, which was near my university, and was from Taiwan. He was very pro-Japanese, so he often talked to me, and it was a great encounter for me. I didn't go out and play around with him like my flatmates and cats in the neighborhood, but I occasionally went to his college gym and cafeteria with him. He lived in West Kensington near both our colleges, very adjacent, and the flat was run by Chan, a Chinese PhD student who was also at Imperial. For some reason, their university researcher lived together in the living room. Around May of my first year, Chan asked if I would take his vacant room, as it was decided that he would soon move in with his English girlfriend. I missed Muzsaks's house. We were very close by that time and she had been very kind to me. But because I was messed up by the large number of cats in the neighborhood, I was tired, so I thought it would be okay to live quietly near the university from the summer. And I immediately decided to move to Lu's flat. When I moved, Muzsaks and her husband saw me off from the front of their house. By that time, most of the cats in the neighborhood had returned to the country or had been replaced. Michelle had returned home and James and Samir had graduated that summer. But I missed the young students who lived with such energy, and it was a memorable thing to stay at the space where they collided. Ever since I moved to West Kensington and started living with Lu, I'd had a very quiet time. In my second year, I was busy with assignments, and I'd been staying at home more often without going on holiday, although Lu used to go somewhere on holidays. At that time, I thought that such days would continue forever. Yes, really, forever. In the winter of the year after I moved to West Kensington, Japanese web news was dominated by COVID-19. And I often listened to things about the pandemic in Italy. At that time, I was busy with a coursework deadline and I couldn't let myself get too distracted. But in the middle of March, my university closed suddenly. While the campus was closed, some students were at a loss because they forgot to take their luggage. I couldn't go anywhere, so I visited Lu, who was studying at the library of Imperial College. When I went to my local Tesco just before the lockdown in London, people were lining up at the checkout, stuffing carts with groceries, as if a tornado had happened inside the store. The toilet paper shelves were, of course, empty. I hurriedly told Lu that I didn't have toilet paper. But Lu was still studying at the library and he was quite carefree and said we could buy it at another store. For the next few days, ambulance sirens began to echo in the street in front of the previously quiet flat. I couldn't stand the noise, so much so that I booked a flight to Japan. A week after lockdown started, I left Lu in the flat and returned to Japan. Heathrow Airport was eerily quiet on the night of my departure. And the terminal was full of British people waiting for a plane to escape the outskirts of London. On the bench at the terminal, I remembered the first time I came to London, how it was raining. The day I became a cat, Lu's cat, and how I went out to play with other cheerful cats. Would I be a cat when I returned to Japan? Wasn't London the only device that vibrated my blood vessels? Would cats disappear when I returned to Japan?
Chapter 5. Innovation. What happens when I become a cat?
In the spring of my second university year, I returned to my apartment near Kyoto Station, the starting point, more than a year earlier than I had expected to. My apartment was so close to the station that I could see the bullet trains. And I could hear the station announcements whenever I opened the window. My little brother now lived alone in the apartment where I had lived before I came to London. As soon as I returned to Japan, a national lockdown was announced, and people disappeared from the town. The city, which was once full of tourists, became flat and scenic like a traditional woodblock print. During the lockdown, I sometimes took a walk along the Kamo River like I had when I was a human being. But strangely, I was still a cat. My little brother wasn't aware of this. Though I couldn't tell if he was aware and just not saying anything. This isolated life was a lonely spaceship life that seemed to resemble the luscious time in the past of floating on the Thames. Around June, when the lockdown in Kyoto was eased a bit, I met up for the first time in a while with a former university friend, who was now a researcher in the university's engineering department. He was still a weirdo the same as before. Lunch could have been in the university cafeteria, but I went to a cafe that served big and delicious omelette rice near the university, which I've always liked and used to go to. I asked him why I suddenly became a cat, which had led me to engage with a large number of cats, and why Lou's cat disappeared after it happened. He said, "It's possible for humans to become cats. It's a kind of extension. For example, your wireless earphones are syncing with your smartphone via Bluetooth. So you and the cat may have a similar relationship. Expansion doesn't change the body. Maybe Lou's cat was closer to you." He then started talking about someone's treatise. But I wasn't sure what he was saying because I had become a cat at that time. Even if I had been a human, I think his story would still have been very complicated. Before I knew it, time had passed and I was busy with second-year exams, but in the latter half of July, Japan was in the middle of summer. I was supposed to be back in London in June, but my plane ticket was cancelled twice and had been rearranged for August, just after the last term of my second year. Kyoto was slowly regaining its vitality, but it didn't seem to be crowded with its former tourists. At the intersection of Shijo-Kawaramachi, which can be said to be the Piccadilly Circus of Kyoto, many empty buses were spinning around. And it was as if we were at an amusement park with nobody there. As I walked along the Kamo River, I remembered when I was a decent human. Along the river, there were couples who still sat at regular intervals, young people playing smartphone games alone, people practicing musical instruments alone, and people practicing handball alone against the wall. It was such a peaceful space that I couldn't imagine what was happening on the earth. It was fiction, the usual sights, the landscape of my hometown, and the landscape of the past for me. The plane was cancelled 3 times, and I ended up returning to London in mid-August, the hottest day in London that year. The plane was spacious, with only 5 passengers, including myself, and 5 flight attendants on board. Not surprisingly, all the passengers were able to raise their armrests and lie down across all 3 seats, which made it feel a bit like first class. Heathrow Airport, which I had come back to again, was quieter than I had imagined, and I was able to get through customs in no time. From the airport, I boarded a cab again and returned to the flat in West Kensington. The cab driver didn't talk to me this time. Through the window from inside the cab, everything in the City of London was shining. And people seemed to be celebrating the end of the pandemic. However, I definitely felt some scratches there. I knew a little that this wasn't the same London anymore. But I was overwhelmed by the joy and relief of coming back. Upon arriving at the flat, I found Lou was on a trip with his friends. From that day on, I would start a lonely 2-week isolation again. There were some problems with my new flat life after I came back to London. It was a matter of neighbourly noise. During the 6 months I was absent, the inhabitants of the building had all been replaced except for me and Lou. The former residents had moved out during the lockdown. Once lockdown ended, new people started moving in. One after another, until it was completely different. Now, the problem was that in the flat just above mine, where a middle-aged British woman once lived, a new group of young Italians had moved in. One of them, Enrico, was a graduate student attending a music college near my university. He was a composer and a performance instructor. So we ended up being showered from morning till night with a huge amount of music for his compositions and music lessons. I asked him to turn down the volume a little. I didn't want him to play at night. And I seemed to go mad. But he said he had no choice but to work in his flat. It was difficult to stop the music because he was playing for work and he couldn't use any room in the university or studio. I gave up complaining halfway through and decided to buy an electronic piano and violin instead and to practice and compose freely to distract myself. Did he feel a little sorry? After that, he brought me homemade pizza from time to time. The residents upstairs were often professionals after that, and there were also tennis instructors, so during the subsequent lockdown, tennis footsteps were added to the noise. After my 2 weeks of quarantine, I was fine and free and immediately went to Westfield in West London. The huge shopping centre wasn't as vibrant as it used to be, but it was crowded with customers coming and going. I went to the cinema there many times without any particular meaning. It was probably because movie tickets were half price, and I couldn't think of anything else to do. Another time, I went to Costa in Kensington Olympia for the first time in a while and was thinking about various things alone at the table outside. How the ice of iced coffee melts in milk. Students who graduated this year did not have a graduation ceremony. I couldn't find any cats around me and I might be lonely. I think Kensington has more dogs than cats. But the weather was nice and the wind was nice and I wanted to sit there forever. And I thought at that time that the good things about London after the first lockdown were that many people had started wearing masks. Many were kind and caring to others. And the roads and buses had become cleaner than before. In September, I travelled to several cities in England for 2 weeks before the start of the new term of my final year. First, I went to Reading to see my university friends. And from there I went to Bristol. Bristol was a city I'd always wanted to visit. As soon as I got to Bristol Temple Meads, I caught a taxi and headed for Clifton Bridge. The taxi driver was a very friendly person. He said the tourists were gradually returning. The best view in Bristol was from Cabot Tower up a small hill. People were stuck to the hill like decorations on a cake, each sitting on a patch of grass or a bench and relaxing. But unfortunately, I still couldn't find a cat. I was the only cat in Bristol. But I wasn't surprised. When I was waiting for the train from Bath to Gloucester, I came up with some ideas, such as the British summer, the spring pandemic, and the end of the pandemic. My studying abroad would end in the next year. What I couldn't do in the first or second year could be done this term. What I wanted to do was to meet new students. The train arrived and I headed to Gloucester, where I was booked into a hotel. On arrival at the station, I didn't get a good impression of the place. I quickly passed through a dark pedestrian tunnel to my hotel. The hotel was in such a state that a strong guard was stationed at the entrance, and the lights on the street looked a little gloomy. When I went to check in, a young woman at the reception gave me information about the steam locomotive. Although Gloucester is a rural town, it seems to be a place that tourists tended to visit. The next day, I got up early and headed to the station to catch the Gloucestershire steam locomotive. I took a taxi to the steam locomotive departure point and boarded the train on time. When the train departed, the scenery became an English summer landscape, and I just spent time watching the green and blue lines flowing through the train window. Next door was an old English couple who had seemed to be waiting for this for a long time. I was thinking of Ms. Sachs and the cats. I wasn't a cat in an old steam locomotive. The long summer holiday in England, which I have always admired, was short, lonely and dazzling. Chapter 6. Secret. His secret. Well, unfortunately, less than 2 months after my summer trip, London went into a pandemic and lockdown again. Christmas was cancelled. And during the winter months until April, I once again led a long, locked down and isolated life with Lou. During this time, I was trapped in the flat in West Kensington. But I would like to share with you a little bit from that time. There were cat territories around Ms. Sachs's house, but the Kensington flat area was mostly a foxy area, probably because of the large number of domestic dogs. I used to encounter foxes in front of the flat before COVID, but after the lockdown, the fox gangs started intimidating the street and social meeting places secretly. I wasn't particularly close to the foxes, but I sometimes heard their terrible gossip, perhaps because they were all bored during the lockdown period. After all, entertainment had decreased and there was no other fun to be had, so this was probably the case. And the foxes didn't realize I was a cat. I was also secretly checking the news that mice were moving from the city to the residential areas. During the second lockdown in November, Café de Paris, once a bewitching memory, went bankrupt, and Hampstead's pub with Ryan and Miles closed down. Naturally, the venue for the mice auction, the top floor of O'Neill's in Chinatown, also seemed to be closed. And because the restaurants and pubs weren't open, the mice seemed to be moving their homes from the city, tube stations, and Soho areas to more food-rich residential areas. Unfortunately, there was no sign of any mice in my flat, but it must have been exciting in Ms. Sachs's neighborhood. So I was really in a food crisis during this quarantine. This was also clear. But as the number of mouse residents decreased, landlords who rented rooms to mice here and there ended up with a lot of vacant rooms, which was a big problem. The few mice left in London must have been able to stand up to landlords more than ever before. And in February, I finally became a cat again, because of the starvation I'd suffered. I started working in a ghost kitchen at the site of a scrap wood factory in Battersea. There are always mice where there is a kitchen. In the ghost kitchen, cats were actually working instead of ghosts, for the reason I mentioned earlier, although there were living things other than cats. We usually didn't come out, and customers ordered food with the delivery app, but I felt again that it was a strange world to not know where the food actually came from. In my section of the kitchen were the Polish boss Freddy, the chef from Myanmar, Win, and a Mongolian chef called Amal. The kitchen was a paradise for cats. There was a surplus, of course, to eat fish, which was more costly than mice. Eve, who washed the dishes 6 days for a week, was a nice guy who always talked to me, but I didn't seem to be able to understand much of what he said. He always ate sweets during his breaks. At the same time, I was drowning in alcohol. That said, the only thing I drank was a few glasses of red wine before going to bed. One day, in the beginning of March, when we were informed that the lockdown would be extended until April, Lou brought up the idea of returning to Taiwan. He wanted to prepare for his remaining research work after returning home. So he would return to Taiwan and no longer stay in London after graduation. I didn't see him off. After so long a quarantine life, interaction with him became less important. And his existence may have already disappeared in me. Around the beginning of April, he was gone before I knew it. Then, I was no longer a loose cat. The reason why I stopped becoming a cat may be that I lost the connection. In May, the city began to regain its vibrancy, as lockdown began to ease little by little like last year. However, I had no hope of recovery somehow. Probably because too many things had happened in the last few years. Following an introduction from Lou, a Japanese student will become my new flatmate from tomorrow. I don't know who he is yet, but if he's not a cat, even if he's Japanese like me, he's probably as dead to me as all the other humans. Right. I opened a bottle of strange craft beer I got from Eve 2 days ago, and I looked out the kitchen window.